Hi. Thanks everyone for coming to this event. The event is how imperialism ruined Syria. It's being organized by the Revolutionary Communist Party, and we're organizing this discussion because it's an incredibly relevant topic that affects this whole situation in the Middle East that for decades has been a region marred in imperialist intervention, and today we're seeing the effect that that's having on millions of people. So Marcus is going to give us an introduction and analysis and perspective for the situation. Then we're going to have a discussion, an open discussion where people will be able to share their thoughts, contributions, questions, and then Marcus will wrap up. So Marcus, are you ready?
Yes.
Cool.
It would be funny if I said no.
I'd have to crack some jokes or something.
That's right. So, on December 8th, the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria collapsed. And it happened in a blink of an eye. If you were looking away, if you had your head turned during these events, you probably missed exactly what happened. But it began with a so-called rebel offense that began on November 27th, which was only 2 Wednesdays ago. And by Sunday, this Sunday, Assad had flown out of the country. Reports are saying that he's hanging out in Moscow these days. Now, the Ba'ath regime that he presided over lasted since 1963. It survived wars, coups, invasions, and one of the grisliest civil wars that has taken place in modern history. Assad himself ruled for 24 years, and he took over from his father that had ruled from, I think, 1973 onward. So this is a long-standing dynasty, and it almost seemed like it was going to stick around forever. So it came as quite a surprise to a lot of people that it not only collapsed, but it happened so rapidly. Now, the capitalist media in countries like Canada is hailing this as some kind of great victory for the Syrian people. If you read the press and what they're saying, you almost get the idea that war is over in Syria, that they abolished bad things. I got a quote from Justin Trudeau here. He said this on the day that Assad abdicated power. And Trudeau said, "The fall of Assad's dictatorship ends decades of brutal oppression. A new chapter for Syria can begin here, one free of terrorism and suffering for the Syrian people." Now, obviously, Assad's regime was quite brutal. I don't necessarily blame any Syrian or Lebanese person for feeling happy that he's gone. But I think we need to be very clear about what's going on here. Any idea that this is the beginning of a peaceful, a liberal democratic stage for Syrian history is, I think, very naive. And I think we should be careful about what they are saying in the capitalist media. This is, in fact, not a victory for the Syrian people, but is only going to open the door for new conflict and new suffering. And I think the first question we should ask ourselves when reading about this is, who are these rebels that the news are talking about? When you hear this phrase, rebel, it invokes, these inspiring freedom fighters, these people battling oppression, almost gives you the image of, Luke Skywalker, right? But no, these people are Islamists. They're jihadists, right? They actually don't have much of a different ideology than even ISIS did. No, the main militia that led this offensive that took place over the past couple weeks was HTS. Now, HTS used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra, and this was the Syrian wing of al-Qaeda. As a matter of fact, it not just shares ideological links with ISIS, but shares organizational links with ISIS. They sprouted from the same, fundamentalist organizations. Now, Jabhat al-Nusra formally split ties with al-Qaeda back in 2016, but it wasn't because they broke with, religious fundamentalism. It was over tactical questions. At least formally, they wanted to focus more on, Syria. They wanted to take more of a nationalist outlook rather than this kind of, internationalist, jihadist approach. And in fact, around the time that Jabhat al-Nusra split, when they're talking about al-Qaeda, they're very friendly towards them. You notice that in, any of the statements they put out around that time. For example, I have this quote here. This is from 2015, shortly before they split from al-Qaeda. Jolani, the leader of the group, said this: "If we remain with al-Qaeda or not, we will never give up our principles. We will continue to say that we want to empower Sharia, and we will strive to do so. We will continue with our jihad and will not make truces or stop a battle with our aggressor. Very principled in a way. You see them not giving up their true beliefs, right? And now really what's happened here is, nothing about their ideas has changed. They've merely changed up their image to make themselves appear more palatable to Western imperialism, so that these capitalist countries and these capitalist media outlooks have an easier time painting a friendly image of them and supporting them. And in fact, this isn't just a guess. We don't have to guess what HTS would do in power, because in fact, they have been in power. HTS has been ruling the northeastern province of Syria, of Idlib, since 2017. And there, they've maintained a very oppressive regime, actually. As a matter of fact, March of this year, March of 2024, there are mass protests in Idlib directed against HTS, these so-called rebels and freedom fighters. And you know how they responded? Well, they had armored vehicles that they slammed through the crowds. They arrested people, they tortured people, and there's evidence that HTS has conducted disappearances against people, making dissidents just vanish and go away. And in fact, one very, I think, interesting update is that I've been reading, there's these sources in pro-Israeli and also pro-Hezbollah media that's currently reporting that HTS's leader has plans to disarm the Palestinian militias that currently exist and operate in Syria. So I think all of this taken together really exposes the hypocrisy of Western imperialism and our politicians in this country. You can't read any article without Palestine that doesn't mention the fact that Hamas is considered a terrorist organization, that Hezbollah is considered a terrorist organization, that the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine is considered a terrorist organization. But I haven't seen any Canadian news outlet, not a single one, mention the fact that HTS is considered a terrorist organization by the Canadian government. Not a single one. I'm curious if anyone has seen otherwise. And there's a big difference. This time, the Islamists overthrew one of their enemies. Assad was a big ally of Russia and Iran, which are two of the main enemies of NATO. So of course, this time they present it as a win for democracy, as progress, right? And this is a classic tactic. Western imperialism has a very long tradition of supporting Islamist groups against their enemies. Just for example, I have here an article headline. Sounds like it could have been written recently. This was from December of 1993. The headline is, "Anti-Soviet Warrior Puts His Army on the Road to Peace." I'm going to open up the room. Does anybody know who this article is about? It's about Osama bin Laden. And as a matter of fact, bin Laden's initial core was trained up by the CIA against the Soviet Union. This tactic of supporting religious fundamentalists against American and Western enemies, this is how we got the Taliban. This is how we got Al-Qaeda. This is how we got ISIS. They've tried this before, and every time it's ended in disaster. Now, I think this, this presence of Western imperialism is a very important factor. What's happening in Syria and what's happened in Syria cannot be disconnected from world politics. Because in effect, the Syrian civil war was a wider proxy war between two opposing imperialist camps. Now, I think to properly understand this, before I can get into that in more detail, I think it's necessary to go over a bit of the history of the country. Now, a lot of people don't realize, but before the civil war, Syria had one of the highest standards of living in the Middle East. I was actually looking up some statistics about public education. You had 90% of primary school age children actually attending state-ran public schools. You had decent wages. You had this big industrial society with a relatively high developed economy. And there's a reason for that. That's because for a while, Syria had actually abolished capitalism. In the 1960s and the 70s, you had this phenomena where a layer of army officers took control of the country and they implemented this kind of bureaucratically planned economy. Now, this wasn't a socialism that was based on a workers' democracy, a socialism that the Revolutionary Communist Party puts forward, but it was this rigid top-down model that was based on the Stalinist Soviet Union. And because of this, actually the economy in Syria after the 60s grew very quickly. During the 70s, GDP growth grew by an average of like 9% every year. A couple of years, it was as high as like 25%. This far outpaced what was happening in any other country at the time. So this is the situation. You had this very repressive state at the time, but living standards were generally improving for society. So there was general support for this regime for a number of years. Now this changed in the 80s and 90s. During that period, you had this global general movement towards privatization, against the socialization of the economy. It was during this period that the Soviet Union collapsed, China began its tradition back to capitalism, and even the big capitalist countries. You had these figures like Reagan and Thatcher and Chrétien. Or Mulroney. Anyways, both of them did this, who implemented harsh privatization and austerity in the economy. So this was the situation in Syria in the 2000s. Suddenly, there was this growing poverty and social inequality, and a layer of the state bureaucracy that was enriching itself by plundering the state's economic resources. Really good example of this is this guy, Rami Makhlouf. He was actually Assad's cousin, and the men in Syria. This very open corruption that was going on. Change the psychology of people, right? You still had this oppressive regime, but now living standards were getting worse. It was very clear that the system wasn't benefiting anybody at all. And in 2011, this paved the ground for the Arab Spring revolution in Syria. Now, of course, the Arab Spring was this incredible mass movement. It was a revolution across the Middle East, which took place over the course of a few years. Now, in a couple countries, mainly Egypt and Tunisia, the revolutions actually succeeded in taking down the old dictatorship. But in Syria, things developed along a different lines. The leadership of the movement in Syria was hijacked by rich businessmen who had ties to American imperialism. And they actually asked America to intervene and help them overthrow Assad. And America did intervene. They answered this call. They funded something to the tune of $1 billion into arming and training Syrian oppositionists, the so-called moderate rebels that you would hear about in the 2010s. Now, the majority of this money and the majority of this training went to the hands of jihadist groups, like Jabhat al-Nusra, the predecessor of HTS. Now, this alienated the vast majority of Syrian and workers and poor. I don't think I have to explain why, but American imperialism, America, is one of the most hated forces, if not the most hated thing in the Middle East. The Syrian masses had seen what had come of Islamism in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. So what began as a revolution degenerated into a civil war where both sides were reactionary. There was America and the jihadists they were supporting on one end, and on the other hand, you had Assad, who was supported by Russia and Iran. And Russia and Iran poured in a ton of resources to keep Assad afloat. Iran sent in tens of thousands of Iranian troops. There were tens of thousands of Hezbollah troops who went into Syria. And Russia set up military bases that provided indispensable logistical support. Along with this, both countries poured in tens of billions of dollars to support the Assad regime. So really, this developed further into a proxy war between these two imposing imperialist blocs, where you had America and its allies on one hand, and on the other hand, you had Russia and its allies, right? Now, what resulted in this was one of the most destructive civil wars in modern history that killed at least 230,000 people and forcibly displaced 12 million people. Just sit with that figure for a second. And for a while, the winner of this war was actually Assad. In 2017, the imperialists and their allies were forced to sign a ceasefire agreement. At this time, this was actually one of the biggest defeats of American imperialism that had taken place for decades. But after that, things did not get better for the people in Syria. Things got a lot worse. And I got a couple, I think, figures that illustrate this. According to the World Bank, extreme poverty in Syria in 2009 was a marginal figure. Now, 25% of people in the country live in what they define as extreme poverty. 70% of the country lives below the poverty line of 2.15 American dollars a day. More than half of the country is unemployed, and 60% say their main issue is finding food. Now, of course, American sanctions played a very big role in this. As of March of 2022, Syria was the third most sanctioned regime in the world, behind North Korea and Russia. Now, these sanctions targeted really everything that it takes to stay alive. It targeted fuel, it targeted financial transactions, and it targeted infrastructure. So, of course, the people who suffered under this were the poor and working class people in Syria. So this was the general condition. You had horrible poverty below, and on top, the Assad regime was completely rotten. The ruling class was only able to maintain its wealth through corruption and plunder. I've been reading these reports about how army officers would regularly steal gas and electricity generators and then sell it off because that's the only way they could make any money. And Assad had to maintain this corruption through maintaining the dictatorship. Now, this created a profound sense of disillusionment in Syrian society. The general feeling was we had fought, we had defeated America, we had defeated ISIS, but what for? And after a number of years, living like this, the social basis, any kind of support for Assad's regime had completely depleted. The state was like this big hollowed-out tree. It looked very sturdy from the outside, but really all it needed was a shove and someone to shove it to actually topple it over. Now, in this situation, I want you to imagine that if there was a revolutionary communist party in Syria, a party of the poor and the working class in the country, a party that would put forward a program of fighting the imperialists, Assad, and the jihadists, a party that would fight on the program of democracy in all spheres of life, and one that would fight to seize the assets of the parasites on top and put it into collective hands, right? A party like this would be able to play the role that HTS did and become a force of attraction very quickly. And not just in Syria, but across the region, because the exact same conditions and mood that exists in Syria exists all across the Middle East, maybe just a bit more amplified. For example, you have a country like Jordan, with a very oppressive monarchy on top, Western-supported monarchy, I would add, that's oppressing the people, that is implementing state subsidy cuts, and there's massive inflation in the country. The Jordan regime has openly collaborated with Israel against the Palestinians, and that's caused mass resentment in the country. Or you have a country like Lebanon, where there's the same sort of funk, this mood of disaffection, and the state there is completely weak. It's barely functioning. Now, if you had a movement of the working class in either of these countries, they'd be able to topple the state down, in fact, quite easily. Now, this is what would happen if there was a revolutionary leadership. Unfortunately, there isn't a leadership in the country. And as we know, nature abhors a vacuum, so there needed to be some other force that could play this role. And here we get into kind of the events of the past few weeks. I think one key actor that we need to understand is the role of Turkey and the role of Turkish imperialism in the region. Now, Turkey has a number of interests in Syria and has been involved in the Syrian civil war since the very beginning. First of all, the ruler of Turkey, Erdogan, has these sort of neo-Ottoman ambitions. He wants to dominate and have de facto control over northern Syria and parts of Iraq and really span Turkey's sphere of control and influence. A second factor are the refugees that exist in Turkey. There are over 3 million Syrian refugees currently living in Turkey. And the government, which is experiencing an economic crisis, likes to use these refugees as a scapegoat. So Erdogan has been trying to whip up racist chauvinism against these people and essentially kick them out of Turkey as a way to whip up support, a desperate attempt to whip up support for his government. But nobody else wants to take them. Assad didn't want to take 3 million people back into the country, so he's been trying to devise a way to kick them back out. And I'd say the third big interest, and this is an important factor, is the existence of what's essentially a Kurdish autonomous region that currently exists in Syria. Now, I don't have much time to go into the history, but for people who don't know, the Kurds make up about 15 to 20% of the population in the Middle East. They are commonly popularly referred to as the biggest stateless people on earth. And they are oppressed by virtually every regime that they exist under. They're oppressed by Syria, they're oppressed by Iraq, and they're oppressed by Turkey, right? Now, Erdogan has been whipping up this, again, nationalist hysteria against the Turks, or against the Kurds. He's been whipping up oppression against the Kurds. But right over the border in northern Syria, you have essentially this big Kurdish-led enclave that takes up 25% of the country. So this is a very dangerous precedent from Erdogan. The Turkish government has been oppressing this area. They've been attacking this area, sending missiles into it, and they really want to get rid of it so as none of the Kurds in Turkey start to get any ideas, right? So Turkey has been supporting different jihadist groups in Syria for quite some time. For example, they've been supporting HTS extensively. Since 2017, HTS has essentially ruled the province of Idlib, basically under Turkish patronage. And in that way, HTS has been built up into a rather strong force. They've led a partial economic recovery in that province. And HTS is now actually capable of building their own weapons. They're building their own rocket launchers and building their own drones, HTS is an ally of Turkey, but Turkey also holds a number of proxies across northern Syria, the most powerful of which is the Syrian National Army, which is a very incorrect name. It's actually not a Syrian Nationalist Army. It's a Turkish proxy. And really, in effect, it's this group of thugs that the Turkish state has employed to use against its enemies in the region. So you've had this situation for a while. Turkey wanting to build up more influence, maintaining influence within these militia groups right across the border, up north in Syria, and they've been waiting for some kind of opening. And there's two events that have taken place recently that have provided this opening. That is the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. It was these events that have kind of allowed what happened, the fall of Assad, to take place. Soon after October 7th, you had Israel attacked Hezbollah and pro-Iranian forces all across the Middle East. They killed some Iranian commanders stationed in Syria. And of course, they've given Hezbollah a very big bloody nose. They've killed two of their top leaders in a row. And they've actually killed a layer of Hezbollah's most seasoned troops, people who were sent to fight in Syria, who fought in the Syrian civil war, who were brought back to defend the home front in Lebanon after October 7th. So Iran and Hezbollah had to pull all these troops out of Syria and restation them in Iran and Lebanon. And of course, with the Ukraine war, Russia had to restation many of its air forces from Syria back to Ukraine. There's actually some satellite footage that shows that the military presence that it has at its air base in Syria is smaller than it was just a few years ago, before the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So these were really the two forces. There's nobody in Syria that actually supported Assad. They really relied on the support of Iran and Russia to keep afloat. So their main base of support was pulled out of the country. And all of these factors is what set the stage for the collapse of the Assad regime. So, they began their assault on November 27th. And based on what I've read, even HTS in Turkey seemed to be shocked by their own success. At the beginning of the suite, I remember there was some statements by Turkey where they described it as a limited operation. So it seems like what happened is they were planning some kind of incursions around the north, around Aleppo, and they realized just how weak it was, and they just kind of ran with it and took power. And it's actually really clear now that the Syrian army's command structure was in fact reliant on Iranian and allied militia command. And without them, there's nobody on the ground who is really calling the shots at all. So this isn't even just a matter of, the Syrian army was unable to defend itself, but there's nobody in the Syrian army who is willing to put up a fight and potentially die for the Assad regime. The majority of conscripted soldiers were poorly armed, poorly treated, poorly fed, and completely disillusioned with the regime. I remember I was reading these quotes from this, Syrian army officer who said something along the lines of, when the militia approached, they looked like the army, and we looked like the militia. They were better trained and had better morale and had better forces than we did. There's also this very interesting article I was reading from Reuters. It's called How Assad's Army Collapsed in Syria, Demoralized Conscripts, Absent Allies, like when they put just everything in the title, And, it talks about the Syrian troop who was, stationed, and, he got a call from his army officer who told him, well, there is an encroaching militia, and your unit should stand its ground and fight. Now, here's what he describes himself doing. Instead, he put his phone on airplane mode, changed into civilian clothing, dropped his rifle, and fled. As he walked along the road back south, other groups of soldiers were abandoning their posts too. And then he says, I looked back and saw everyone running behind me. When they saw one person flee, everybody started to toss their weapons and run. And there are reports of just these entire roads in Syria that are just littered with just army uniforms, just people dumping them along the road as they walk. And I have one other quote from the same article that gets a bit into the conditions of the Syrian army. It talks about another Syrian troop, and it says that he was paid 500,000 Syrian pounds a month. That's 40 American dollars a month. Army rations were often pillaged before arriving, and sometimes his entire pay went on buying more food. Comrades with money would pay officers $100, which he lacked to get out of service. He said his brigade was supposed to have 80 soldiers, but in reality, it only had 60. So this is really the situation that they encountered. There's nobody in the country that was willing to fight for Assad. This is even the case out west, in the west of the country, where the Alawite sect is located. Now, for people who don't know, the Alawites are they're an ethno-religious sect in Syria. They're the sect that the Assads actually come from. And for a few decades, they have held a relatively privileged position in the Syrian state. Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad would prioritize putting these people in military posts, that sort of thing, right? So there was serious doubt about whether this side of the country would actually accept the rule of this militia. But on the day that Assad fled, there are reports of Alawite towns tearing down statues of the Assads and celebrating that he had left the country. So not even there was anybody willing to actually fight for this guy. Now, I think that there's one important point to highlight. I think when we talk about the fall of the Assad regime, to be honest, that puts it a bit lightly. It's not just the fall of Assad. This is the fall of the Syrian state as we know it. Now, I think that there's a really important lesson here, is that you can't fight imperialism on a capitalist basis. American imperialism could be beat back. It was beat back for a period, but the Syrian masses continued to suffer immensely under Syrian capitalism. And it's not enough to just have something to fight against. You need to be able to improve the conditions of working people in order to keep their support, right? At an eventual point when things keep getting bad and they keep getting worse and there's no improvement in sight, then you lose hope, you lose support for the regime entirely, and there's no way to get it. And there's an important note here that the Syrian revolution is only going to be led by the Syrian workers and poor, or it's not going to succeed at all. So, what are going to be the consequences of Assad's fall? Now, first of all, this is going to be a blow to Iranian and Russian influence in the region. Jilani, the leader of HTS, has already said that he wants to keep Iran out of Syria. And I think for this reason, it's impossible to believe that America and Israel didn't know about the offense and didn't know about the advance in advance, and didn't approve of it, right? And in fact, Joe Biden has been very quick to try to get a little bit of credit for what has taken place. He put out a statement on the day Assad fled where he said, "Our approach has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Through a combination of support for our partners, sanctions against Assad, and diplomacy and targeted military force when necessary, we now see new opportunities opening up for the people of Syria and for the entire region." So I think this is actually just a very blatant, it's an open, honest quote where they are admitting that they have been interfering in Syria for years and have been trying to overthrow the Syrian state. He's just not even trying to hide it. But I also want to point out, too, he talks about new opportunities for the Syrian people. It's not new opportunities for Syria. These are new opportunities for imperialists in Syria to expand their influence and to reap rewards out of the situation. And we see this already. We see this mad scramble. America has been in close touch with Turkey ever since Assad fell. In fact, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, was in Turkey, arrived in Turkey just last week. He's been going all around the Middle East talking to America's allies in the region. And actually, American-backed militias around the region of Al-Tanaf have already expanded their control. And Israel took full advantage of the confusion to destroy tons of military equipment that was left behind by the Syrian army. They just sent out hundreds of airstrikes across the country, trying to weaken Syria militarily as much as possible. They've also gobbled up more land surrounding the Golan Heights, which is a region of Syria that Israel has occupied since 1967. And in fact, Netanyahu just said the other day that he wants to double Israeli settlement in the Golan Heights, right? Not surprising. I don't think surprising at all. One thing I want to say, too, is that the fall of Assad is not going to stabilize the situation at all. In fact, his fall has completely destabilized the delicate balance of forces that existed in the region. And in fact, there's a very real threat of this reigniting the Syrian civil war. For example, the new transitional government that's emerged is not a homogenous force. You have a whole array of different militias across the country that have their own sphere of influence. A bunch of them have different ethnicities and religious views. You have Shia, Sunni, Christian, Druze militias. You have some backed by America, some backed by Turkey, some backed by Jordan. And then, of course, too, the Kurdish-led militias up in the Northeast, they control about 1/4 of the country. And I think one example that I think shows how disjointed these militias are and how much potential exists for violence is actually in the south of the region, which is currently controlled by this group called the Southern Operations Room. This is a group of about 50 different militias. They are led by a couple Druze militias, and this was actually the first group to get into Damascus, right? They're the first group to get into the capital. They are actually composed of 50 different militias that before HTS started attacking Assad, they're all fighting each other. I mean, I read this article from The Economist that says that they were committing, and I just thought this is a very funny way of putting it, tit-for-tat kidnappings against one another, right? So these are the relationships between these militias. I think it's extremely hard to believe that all of these groups will just give up their spheres of control and just willingly allow themselves to be ruled by HTS or any other group from Damascus. There's a ton of combustible material. And already you're seeing fights between different militias. HTS and the Syrian National Army, Turkey's allies, has already been committing attacks against Kurdish troops and have been forcing some Kurds out of different towns and territories. And I'd say another aspect in here is the question of ISIS. There is potential for a certain reemergence of ISIS. They're very much weakened compared to where they were in 2014, but they still control some pockets. There's some indications that they're going through a little bit of a revival in the months and in the past couple of years leading up to this. And you also have the question of there's something like 10 to 40,000 ISIS troops that are actually held in prisons all around Syria. So if you have fighting between different militias taking place, and this gives the opportunity for some pockets of these fighters to escape. Well, that's, I think, just that's a package of dynamite just laying in the foundation of the country. Now, I think it's impossible to predict in advance what exact repercussions this will have on Middle Eastern politics, but I think it just suffices to say that there will be only further instability going forward. Now, I think just to conclude, I think the example of Syria shows us the nature of one of the most important fights that we have today, which is the fight against imperialism. The capitalists, the ruling class of today's society, are completely unfit for rule. They have narrow interests based on profit, and only profit, that are increasingly coming into contradiction with civilized life itself. And this is not just a thing you can just change within the confines of capitalism. Imperialism is a natural feature of capitalism. Big capitalist countries seek to dominate small countries and nations in the exact same way that big companies fight to dominate the market. That's why Lenin said that imperialism is just the highest stage of capitalism. So you have this battle between these different capitalist powers, and in the course of this process, you have these different rivalries and alliances and wars that break out to maintain spheres of influence within these alliances, right? And countries like Syria become the battleground for these destructive international wars. As I said before the Civil War, Syria had one of the higher standards of living in the Middle East. It was an industrial power with good education, decent health care, decent wages. There's this supporter of the Revolutionary Communist Party who's Lebanese, and I was talking with him, and he told me that for decades, like if his family ever needed any health procedure done, then they would just go to Syria, because healthcare was that much better in Syria than it was in Lebanon at the time, right? So these are the conditions that existed before. And the imperialists ruined it. Imperialism ruined Syria, and imperialism has created this immense poverty. It's in the exact same way that imperialism ruined Libya, ruined Iraq, and ruined countless other countries around the world. And now they're playing this cynical game of just redividing Syria again, which is very likely to just increase and create more warfare. And it's not just Syria. You see this exact process happening everywhere across the globe. We've seen what the imperialists have allowed to happen to Palestine. The Ukraine war started out as this proxy battle between America and Russia, and that's what led to the invasion of Ukraine. And you see a ton of small wars all happening all across the ex-colonial war they're creating these massive humanitarian crises. You have the wars and civil wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Sudan. And this is only going to increase so long as capitalism is left standing. There's a famous quote, almost feels a little corny saying it because it's so quoted, but I just think it's really fitting here. There's a German communist, Rosa Luxemburg, who said that we have the choice of either advancing into socialism or degenerating into barbarism. And I think today you see these elements of barbarism that are emerging. And there's really only one way forward from this. We need a revolutionary struggle, a global revolutionary struggle against capitalism and this starts here at home. This is what the Revolutionary Communist Party is trying to do. Canada is a member of NATO. It is an imperialist power. It's one of the main allies of America. Overthrowing Canada would have a big effect on world politics and would have a big effect on the strength of capitalist imperialism. But we're not just organizing here in Canada. We're part of the Revolutionary Communist International. And in fact, we have groups that are organizing in all of the key countries here. We have comrades in America, we have comrades in Turkey and comrades in Syria who are organizing in these conditions and who are fighting to have an international revolution against capitalism. So if you're not yet a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party and you want to fight against imperialism, then you need to join us.